Hello and welcome back to the Polaris Travel Health Podcast. Thanks for tuning in with us this week. I'm Jason Komet, and this week Jaden and I will be discussing what you need to know about yellow fever.
Yeah, we wanted to share this episode as a resource for those of you who may want to know more about yellow fever or are considering a trip to an area where you may be at risk. So let's get started. What is yellow fever and how would someone catch it?
Okay, well, yellow fever is a viral infection and it's carried by mosquitoes. The main mosquito, or really the only mosquito that carries it, is the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which isn't a mosquito that we have around in this part of the world, but certainly is a common mosquito in a lot of tropical countries throughout the world.
Right. So if you were to get bit by one of these mosquitoes, how long would it take before your symptoms start to show up? And what would the symptoms be?
Usually it's about 3, 4, 5, 6 days after you've been bitten for you to have symptoms. And most of the time you feel unwell. You get your fever, headache, a little bit of that sort of thing. It's not a super severe illness in majority of people, but there is certainly an significant chance that it could morph into something more serious, where essentially you basically go into shock. You turn yellow, essentially you get jaundiced and that sort of thing. And you can definitely die. If you get to that point, it's usually 50% of people die. And, when you start talking about deaths worldwide, I think the number, actually, I think you would research this number to get the up-to-date number, Jaden, about 30,000 deaths a year, and mostly in Africa. So it is a significant illness in the sense that you can definitely die from it. And in the middle of an outbreak, it's definitely you're at risk. And it's not like something you're going to have immunity to under normal circumstances.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of people from Canada, being that we don't have that type of mosquitoes, there isn't a lot of chance that you would have come in contact or would potentially even know that would be a concern. So with all that being said, what regions are yellow fever common in besides, we kind of mentioned Africa, and what types of activities could put you at risk for contracting yellow fever?
Okay, so yellow fever, really, there's 2 continents that you have to think about. Think about Africa, but specifically sub-Saharan Africa. You're not going to get yellow fever in Egypt, for example. Like it's the climate, it's more of a desert climate. We need more of a tropical type setup. So you start thinking about everything south of the Sahara, your Nigerias and your Kenyas and the Congo and that sort of thing. Going down, pretty much into the Angola area in parts of Zambia. So basically the middle part of Africa is what it amounts to. And then into the areas of South America that are tropical forest, like the Amazon basin, like the interior parts of Brazil and Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, like the places where there's jungle. And there's no yellow fever really north of the Panama Canal. So there's some concerns in parts of Panama. And the only countries in the Caribbean that are really of concern, it's one country, Trinidad and Tobago. And if you look at it on the map, it's practically touching South America as it is already. But those are the places. There's no yellow fever in Asia at all. And we're going to probably talk a little bit about that, about why it's not there and why we want to make sure it stays that way. But from locations, those are the kind of locations. And I think as far as risk activities, anytime you're spending more time outdoors for, extended travel, in rural areas, camping, staying in places where there's no air conditioning and you're basically outside, you're exposed to the elements and not in a nice sealed up air conditioned place. Right. Those would be the places of more risk.
Right. So what kinds of things can people do to prevent yellow fever?
Yellow fever is a vaccine preventable illness, and the vaccine has been around for a long time. I think late 1930s, long time. And the vaccine is highly effective. We're talking about probably 99% effectiveness in a period of time after you've gotten the dose. So we do have a highly effective vaccine that is available. It is a little bit different from other vaccines that not just anywhere can give yellow fever vaccine. We are at Polaris Travel Clinic. We're a certified yellow fever vaccination center by Health Canada. So we've been federally approved to give the vaccine and also provide the documentation that will get you into countries if it is a requirement to get into that country. It's a live vaccine, which basically means that it's a weakened form of the virus, and you give it as one single dose. And usually you're covered off for life after that.
Right. So you say being covered for life. Does that mean that there's kind of not normally any booster doses or like a sort of time limit as there are for other types of vaccines where you would have to kind of update your status, say every decade or so?
Yeah. So your immunity really fully kicks in about 10 days after you've received the vaccination. And we know that it takes probably, close to a full month to develop the full level of protection. Historically, in the past, we always used to say you need a booster every 10 years. In fact, we would write up our yellow fever cards and we would put an expiry date of 10 years in the future on it. Really, what we found, as I mentioned earlier, this is an old vaccine. It's been around for a long time. There's been a lot of post-release surveillance of this vaccine. We think about some COVID vaccines and stuff, but we're watching, for reactions and we're looking at data. We've got like 70 years of data on this vaccine.
Right.
So we know that it is very, very unusual for it not to last for a lifetime perspective. So the need to get a booster dose after 10 years has really been, we've really lifted that requirement at this point. So for example, now when we give out a yellow fever card, we write on there, it's good for the life of person vaccinated. That being said, if you were going to a high risk area, if you're going to an area which was currently undergoing a yellow fever outbreak, and it had been 15 years since your last dose, we may want to look at giving you a booster under those kind of circumstances. But for most typical circumstances, we would not usually give a booster anymore.
Right. So in that case, then, how frequently do you recommend that travelers get the yellow fever vaccine?
Quite often to the countries that are the risk countries. If we have people going to, Nigeria, Kenya, Congo, these kind of places, Brazil, it's pretty standard recommendation. Now, for other countries where it may depend on what your activities are and where you're going, for some places in Peru, for example, you would definitely want to get it, but not. So we always have to look at yellow fever from really two different points of view. We have to look at it from, should we give you the yellow fever vaccine so you don't get sick and die?
Right.
Or also, do you need to get it because it's legally required to get into the country? Because this is a vaccine where some countries will demand proof of vaccination in order to let you in the country. So we have to look at it from both perspectives. And, strangely enough, sometimes one will be the case and not the other. As I mentioned, with Peru, it's not a requirement to get yellow fever vaccine to get into the country. But if you're going to the rainforest, it's a really good idea. It's strongly recommended. But meanwhile, you could have sort of another situation where you may need to get the vaccine, even though more for legal purposes than for actual risk. And, an example that I've seen and I've used it quite a few times in practice is this was a scenario which happened a few years ago. I had a patient and they were flying from Canada into Europe and then they were going to South Africa, but they were stopping off in Kenya on the way. And really, they were going to be in Kenya for a really short period of time and then getting on another plane and flying down to South Africa. So what ended up happening is this person ended up needing to get a yellow fever shot. And the reason that they needed to get a yellow fever shot was because Kenya is a yellow fever risk country. And when you're coming in from coming into South Africa, if you're coming in from a yellow fever risk country, you have to be vaccinated, even though you're in the airport for a chunk of a day and your chances of getting yellow fever are next to nothing. But legally, you have to get it. Now, if that person would have flown directly from Europe down to South Africa, they wouldn't have been in a yellow fever area even for a moment. So they wouldn't have needed to have the vaccine to get in the country. So again, that would be a situation where it was more of a legal requirement, but we needed to do it up.
Right. So is there anyone who cannot or should not get the yellow fever vaccine?
There are a couple of reasons you definitely shouldn't get the yellow fever vaccine. First one is an egg allergy. Now, this vaccine, as I mentioned, it's pretty old school in the sense that how they make it now isn't terribly different than how they were making it back in the 30s. And of course, I think the things are a little more sophisticated in the manufacturing techniques, but still at the end of the day, they make the vaccine in chicken eggs. So if you have a allergy to egg, that's a big problem. Another big issue is it is a live vaccine. So if you are immunosuppressed in any way, so if you are on any medicines that affect your immune system or have any medical conditions. So, a few examples that I would give you is if you're on anti-rejection drugs because you have an organ transplant, your immune system is suppressed, you can't get a yellow fever shot. If you're on certain injectable arthritis medicines or medicines for Crohn's disease that affect your immune system, you can't get the shot. If you have a medical condition where you have HIV and your immune system is suppressed quite a bit, you would need to not get the vaccine unless your immune system had built itself back up a bit. Pregnancy is another thing. Also, you can't get another live vaccine. There has to be a separation time of about 28 days. So that would be a thing where it wouldn't be a permanent reason to not get the vaccine, but we may have to work on our timing on that. Also, we are a bit more careful about giving a yellow fever vaccine to older people. Your risk of developing a more severe reaction to the vaccine increases after you get to be over 60, and after that it can increase further. So sometimes in those circumstances, we want to be a little bit more careful about giving a yellow fever vaccine to a 75-year-old, for example, because their chances of maybe having more of an adverse reaction to it would be higher than a 55-year-old.
Right. Just kind of on the point about not getting another live vaccine within 28 days. Why is that? Is it just kind of too hard on your immune system? Is it just like kind of a cautionary thing or what?
So what happens with live vaccines is that if you get one and then you get another live vaccine within 28 days, it just affects the immune response in the body. So when we're talking about inactive vaccines, like things like hepatitis A or Japanese encephalitis or rabies or even the COVID vaccines, it doesn't matter with those ones about affecting the intervals. But with live vaccines, you won't get as good a response for the second vaccine. And that's why we want to separate it out by 28 days.
Sure. So kind of on another note, of course, obviously, as like a travel health expert, you would want people to get vaccinated if they were traveling to an at-risk area. But what if someone were to return home and they maybe didn't need to get the vaccine to get into somewhere, and so therefore they didn't get it, and they started to feel sick? What should someone do in that situation?
I think anytime that you come back from a trip and it's been less than a month after you've come back and you develop a fever or you feel unwell, you should probably seek medical attention. I think right now, I've even mentioned this to patients before, even if you're not the kind of person who's probably all that willing or excited to run off and see the doctor when you feel a bit unwell, I would probably lower the bar for what would get me in to go to the doctor. And I'll give you an example. It's like, maybe you're the kind of person where, you wouldn't ordinarily, you just wait it out. I would say I'd show up at urgent care or wherever you'd go or to your family doctor and say like, look, I don't feel great. I have a bit of a fever. Ordinarily, I probably wouldn't be too worried about it. But, I was in Kenya 2 weeks ago. And at that point, we'd want to do some testing and sort of see where you're at. So I think, yellow fever, malaria, whatever the reason is, anytime you come back and you have a fever, feel unwell, you should get checked out.
Definitely. If you were to be diagnosed with yellow fever, are there treatment options? Is there like a medication that you can take, or is it just kind of like you have to wait it out and see what happens?
It's symptomatic treatment only. So, rest and fluids and Tylenol, that sort of thing. Those are the kinds of things. And, if you were to get to that point, you would likely be hospitalized. But I'll tell you right now that in Canada, because of the yellow fever rules and of getting into countries, yellow fever cases and returning travelers to Canada are virtually non-existent, thankfully.
Right. I know you said that it's virtually non-existent, but is there any risk of potentially bringing yellow fever into Canada and like perhaps starting an outbreak, such as if an individual who was not vaccinated came home and was bitten by a mosquito in Canada, and then that mosquito then bit someone else?
That's a great question. So the short answer is no. That type of mosquito that we referred to earlier about the Aedes mosquito, We don't have those mosquitoes in Canada. And
Right.
so yellow fever cannot be transmitted with the mosquitoes that we have here. So even if it was the summertime and mosquitoes were out and about, the virus is not transmissible through our types of mosquitoes. So that also goes for, at the same token, things like dengue fever, malaria. None of these illnesses could really ever take root here because for that reason. Once in a blue moon, you'll see a news report, and it just probably would only catch the attention of someone who was really looking for it. There'll be a report of some of these mosquitoes were identified in the summertime, like in southern Ontario, or maybe even southern BC. I'm not sure about BC, but I've seen a report where in someplace by Windsor or whatever, they found some of these mosquitoes in a West Nile trap, for example, looking for West Nile virus mosquitoes and stuff. Usually that is either they got blown there by some kind of windstorm, crazy windstorm, or maybe there was some kind of transportation thing where they got in a crate, and they had survived long enough in the summertime that they were here, but they would never survive the winter, and they would never really able to reproduce or anything. So,
right.
You talk about climate change. Could that be something down the road that could be a problem? Potentially, it could be a thing. I think we could see that. It would be far more likely to see that in areas of the southern United States as opposed to Canada, but could be something further down the line that could be a consideration.
Right. Because is it mostly the climate that determines their ability to survive here?
Pretty much, yeah. These mosquitoes can't make a go of it here and that sort of thing. And we know that in certain areas in the United States, these mosquitoes can be viable, right? This is the same kind of mosquito that was carrying Zika virus. And, we know that sometimes those mosquitoes live in places in Florida and stuff like that, and in Texas. And there have been reports in certain areas of California. So the big thing that has worked in favor there is that those viruses haven't really ever been able to make it significantly into those areas where there would be a lot of spread. If you can remember with Zika virus from a few years ago, there was some local transmission in Florida, for example, but it was relatively limited. But in theory, something like that could happen for yellow fever. The one thing about yellow fever, which makes it a lot harder to transmit, would be that most of the time in these countries that have yellow fever, a lot of times the local primate population will be a reservoir for the virus. But we don't really have primates in the United States or Canada that would be able to do that. We don't have that kind of tropical situation here with the rainforest. Right. So I would say that the smart money would be not very likely we'll ever see yellow fever in Canada, United States anytime soon, but it is a theoretical possibility.
Right. Do the mosquitoes, are they kind of identifiably different in terms of the way that they look, compared to the ones that we would see here?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they look different. They've got a weird, it's sort of, it almost looks like spots on it, like white spots.
Oh, okay.
And it is a noticeably different type of mosquito. And, a topic that we probably would even want to go into further with maybe something like dengue or something, which is the same kind of mosquito. Those mosquitoes actually, they do really well in urban settings. They don't need to be in the middle of nowhere. And they actually like humans as a blood meal, so to speak, more than some other types of mosquitoes. And they're more active in the daytime, which is when people tend to be out and about. So in a lot of ways, they're kind of different from the kind of mosquitoes we have here, because our mosquitoes in Canada are more dusk and dawn. They do better in more rural areas. And like I said, this type of mosquito, really, they're the opposite in that way.
Right. And is it mainly that type of mosquito, because you mentioned Zika and malaria as well, that transmits these types of tropical diseases to humans?
Yeah.
Or are there kind of other types as well?
There are other types, like the malaria is carried by a different type of mosquito called an Anopheles mosquito. But some of these illnesses that we're talking about, like I said, dengue and Zika and yellow fever, it's the same kind of mosquito. In fact, one of the reasons why we're seeing more and more cases of dengue is because urbanization. These type of mosquitoes are actually doing better than they were doing before because of the fact that they like to live in the urban environments. They're probably happier living in a vacant lot filled with tires that have water accumulating in them, as opposed to some lush jungle.
Oh.
That actually would be their preference when it comes right down to it. And that's why we're seeing so much more dengue fever than we used to, because dengue fever, those mosquitoes do really, really well in those settings, and why you can get something like that in the middle of a city.
Right, right. Whereas you would normally kind of think that you would catch something from a mosquito if you were, say, like out and about doing a hike, or just kind of in the jungle somewhere, not when you're I think people get kind of lulled into a sense of safety when they're in the city.
Yeah, well, it's not intuitive as Canadians for sure that
Right.
way. And we still do see that with some illnesses, but yeah, like for this type of mosquito and some of these illnesses, that's not the case.
Right. Well, is there any kind of final thoughts or pieces of advice, kind of other things you wanted to mention about yellow fever?
Yeah, well, there actually was one thing, and I wanted to make sure to mention that we were talking about people that can't get the yellow fever vaccine,
Right.
and whether for a medical reason, that sort of thing. There is recourse for someone like that. So if you were going to be going to one of these countries that require the vaccine and you can't get it, there is the ability, like at our clinic here, since we are a certified yellow fever center, we actually have a separate set of cards. And these cards are essentially waiver certificates, which we can write up for somebody. And when we write these certificates up, we basically write it saying that Jane Smith cannot be vaccinated against yellow fever, and then we can sign off on it. And then you can provide that information to the border guards at the place you're going to, and they can use that. And that is an option that we can potentially do for people that cannot get the vaccine done. And like I said, if you're in a situation like that, you definitely need to talk to somebody who knows what they're talking about in regards to getting all that sorted away and that sort of thing. And we don't really often issue them, but if it is a medically necessary reason, we can issue it. I know sometimes we have people that ask, well, like, what if I just don't want to get the shot? Well, that doesn't really work. No, that's not a legit reason. But and the one thing we do when we do write up the exemption form, we don't get deep into an explanation as to why. We usually just put a note on there saying that the risk of getting the vaccine is too significant for us to give it to you, and for medical reasons. So it's not like we're spilling your whole health history on there, for example. But yeah, that's something that is a possibility that can be done.
Right. And those exemption cards, I know you said you don't write a lot of them, but they tend to be accepted at the border?
Yes, generally they are accepted. Now, in theory, no government is obliged to accept an exemption card.
Right.
But I have never heard of a case where someone got turned down. So one thing about yellow fever, I guess, and I never mentioned this earlier, but I think it's something worth mentioning, the whole concept as to why it's a required vaccine. Basically, the short answer is the country that requires the vaccination, they really don't care about you. It's not about you. It's about them. Yeah. They're trying to make sure there's no chance that you're bringing yellow fever into the country. I touched on this earlier. There's no yellow fever in Asia. Well, there's a reason for that. They have the right kind of mosquitoes there. But because of these travel restrictions, they've been able, and vaccination requirements, they've essentially been able to keep yellow fever out of the country. So that's why we run into these situations where someone will come to us and say, oh, I was on Google and I found out I'm going to Thailand and I found out that they're not going to let me in unless I have a yellow fever shot. Well, actually, no. If you're flying from Canada and say you're stopping off in Hong Kong or Taiwan or something like that, and then going to Thailand from there and basically just transiting the Pacific Ocean, you're not going through any yellow fever countries. Right. So in Thailand and Vietnam and some of these other countries, they do require yellow fever certification, but only if you're coming from one of those countries. So the vast, vast majority of people coming from Canada are not going through those countries, so they don't need the shot. But if somehow you have a really bad travel agent, or you're going on some kind of really circuitous route, if you did go from, say, Canada to Europe, you stopped in Ethiopia or Kenya, and you went from Ethiopia or Kenya to Thailand, everybody on that flight would have to prove yellow fever vaccination, because Ethiopia is a yellow fever risk country. And if you didn't have that, you could bring it in, and that would be the nightmare scenario. You're that person. You flew in from Ethiopia. You weren't vaccinated. Right before you left, you got bit by a mosquito carrying yellow fever. and then you enter Thailand and you're in the cab. Mosquito comes in, bites you, then bites the cab driver. Now the cab driver has yellow fever, and congratulations, you brought yellow fever to Thailand, and it will probably never go away after that.
Right.
That is the reason that they do this, and that is the thought process. So, like I said, a lot of times people even ask us, like, why is it a requirement? And that even gets into some of this talk about COVID vaccines and requirements. A lot of it's going to, again, be because they want to make sure you don't bring it into the country. And that's what they're doing with yellow fever. And the yellow fever mandatory requirements for countries, every individual country decides how they want to make their own rules. But the thing is, everybody's agreed on the right paperwork. So no matter what your rules are about an individual country, we've all agreed to accept the certificate. So for example, the certificate that we issue, it's in English, but it's written in such a way that even if the border guards can't understand English, they will be able to understand the card. So these cards are universally accepted, and so you always know that you've got that going for you. The card will be accepted if it is required in that country.
Right. Is it the speaking of Asia, is it the same mosquito that carries Japanese encephalitis?
Nope, different mosquito.
Oh.
Actually, the Japanese encephalitis mosquito is much more similar to our mosquitoes in Canada. So I actually, in theory, I don't know if this would ever realistically happen, but the mosquito that carries Japanese encephalitis, that would be more of a likely candidate to make it to Canada, just because that type of mosquito is very similar to what we have here, not related to yellow fever, dengue, Zika, malaria.
I see. So they have two different types of potentially dangerous mosquitoes.
Oh, there's many different variations. We could probably sit and talk about mosquitoes, all the different types and that sort of thing. Hey, maybe that's an idea for a future episode, possibly.
Maybe so. We'll have a mosquito episode.
Yeah.
That would be kind of fun. All right, then. Anything else you wanted to mention?
I think that mostly covers it. Yellow fever is a pretty interesting topic, actually, and fortunately, it's not something that we barely ever see as far as like a travel disease, because of the fact that if you're going to an area, typically speaking, you get the vaccine. But it certainly is a thing. You know, there's been outbreaks in Brazil lately. There's been outbreaks in some parts of Western Africa. So it's still absolutely a thing in this world. And once it does start to cycle in the population, it can sort of snowball, and there can be an outbreak in a specific area, and it can really snowball, like I said, and it can just sort of self-perpetuate. And people can definitely die, unfortunately.
Yeah, it definitely seems like the type of thing that would be really hard to contain.
Oh yeah, because once it gets into that cycle, and it's in even in an urban setting, it just perpetuates itself. Those mosquitoes are around, and they bite a person that's infected, and they can infect another person very easily, and that sort of thing. So yeah, it can definitely perpetuate quite easily.
Right. Yeah, and especially in places that have like more fragile health infrastructure, that could be definitely a very serious thing. Oh,
absolutely. Because, although there's no specific treatment, if you are given the right type of supportive treatment, fluids, and the right medications for control fever and stuff like that, certainly your possibility for an outcome is a lot better than no treatment.
Right. Yeah.
Or poor treatment.
Yeah, definitely. All right, then. Well, thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of the Polaris Travel Health Podcast. Make sure you're following us on Twitter at Polaris Travel RX, and like us on Facebook, and that you check us out at our website as well. We hope that you'll tune in with us again next week.
Great. Thanks, Jaden.
Thank you.